excited to introduce our next speaker, Domino Risch. And it's great because Domino says that she's passionate about creating awesome places to work, like emphasis on awesome places to work. But the extra bit is the awesome places that make you healthier because you go there to that work. Now that's interesting, isn't it? An interior designer, so this is going to be really interesting. Please join me in welcoming Domino to the stage.
Hi everyone. I know it's getting to that time in the afternoon where I generally fall asleep in front of my Zoom calls. So I'm just going to say, how about everybody stand up, reach up to the sky, breathe in deep, just stretch for a second. How's that? Roll the shoulders a little bit. Okay, now we're ready. We can sit down, okay? I'm really passionate about creating healthy workplaces that are inclusive, workplaces that maybe bring you some joy because you work there or you experience them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think we're all looking for from our workplaces in a hybrid world. At Hassell, we're architects and workplace designers and designers of everything in general, and we have been running a workplace survey for the last 3 years to try and understand the impact of the pandemic and how it is impacting what we do, which is create spaces to support people. So I'm going to run us through a little bit of what our findings are from the last 3 years, which leads me to the second part, which is identifying the emerging models in physical space that have come about because of the pandemic, and finally leading to some insight for how you can start to strategise the use of space for success in 2020 and beyond. When we first started surveying people back in 2020, it was sort of a month or two into the pandemic when we were all suffering from immense amounts of Zoom doom. The world was upside down, we were all terrified, and we just wanted to check in with the people we cared about in Australia and how they were feeling. And that was great. And then in 2021, we kind of were still in the pandemic. We thought it would be over, but it wasn't. And so we wanted to check in and say, okay, how's everyone else in the world doing? So we expanded our survey to include Singapore, the United Kingdom and the United States, and it was about 1,800 people. This year, I'm about to give you some of the findings on what we've found. We wanted to know what's driving people's decisions about where they work and how they work, and maybe how, as workplace professionals, we can start to nudge that behaviour a little bit. We included mainland China this time, which has given us a different perspective. So it's 2,500 office-based workers from all of these regions around the world. Maybe they weren't office-based when they answered the survey, because depending on where you were, you may not have had a workplace to go to. So back in 2020, we found 6 major findings from our survey. The first was, contrary to every newspaper in the world, the office isn't dead. It's not going to die. We're not going to suddenly not need them. Everyone calm down. The second thing we found was that during the pandemic, we were all forced to make some fairly radical changes on how, when, and where we do our work. And those habits that were formed in the crucible of lockdown have taken, and are still taking, I would suggest, a very long time to shift. Actively breaking habits is something that needs to be done with intention, and I think we're still learning that lesson. But ultimately we realised that what people are looking for around the world is flexibility. They were given flexibility, ironically, through the inflexibility of lockdown, and that is something that is here to stay. We learned that a well-designed office is a very powerful tool for culture and performance when you're able to use it, obviously, and that at that point in time, culture had held steady. People were still feeling engaged and part of their organisation, remembering this is before the Great Resignation hit. We did, though, realise that legacy workplace strategies in how space is organised, and if we think about the archetypal open plan office, it maybe isn't the best strategy to support hybrid working, and that maybe things need to be changed. So the year after that, we discovered that the pathway for returning to work varies, but there were patterns emerging around the world that made those patterns clear. We realised that in understanding presence and intention and following that data, it's really the only way of being able to create a successful return to work strategy, and that there is no magic formula. You can't go and say, well, I want everybody back 100% of the time and I'm just going to stamp my foot and make sure that that happens, because that's not likely to work. We understand, and we expected actually last year, that we would see a lot more short-term initiatives, piloting, experimental spaces, testing new technology, and that has certainly happened, but not to the degree. And I think that's partially because I don't think we're through the pandemic yet, or even if we're through the pandemic a certain degree, enough things have changed in the world that this is the new normal. So we have to react to that rather than wait for it to be over. The headlines were all saying last year that 60% of people want to work at work 60% of the time. We found the same thing, but it was for varying reasons. And fundamentally, your stage of life and the length of your commute are the two things that mostly impact your decision on where you work. And if you want to come get people back, you have to nail the basics. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So you're the first audience in the world to see these results from our 2022 survey, which now includes mainland China. The first insight is that hybrid work is definitely here to stay for knowledge workers, but in all sectors. So from law to accounting, creative industries, process industries, technology firms, for everyone. It's here to stay. The second insight, which some of you may be really fascinated in, and we'll show you some data in a second, is that the more time people spend in the office, the more engaged and connected they are. My question is, how are those two reversible? Third, if you force people to come back to the office, our data says they will leave. They are unhappy. They need flexibility and choice and autonomy in how and where they do their work. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. People have different reasons for wanting to work from home. It's not so much about the pandemic, at least here in Australia anymore. It's about deeper factors, and everybody's got a different set of parameters. So if you really want to know, you have to ask. Spaces to focus are as, if not then more important than what everybody's talking about in workplace, which is it's got to be a place to socialise and collaborate. Because we can tell from the data we're getting back that if you don't offer focus space, then people won't want to come back, because what they perceive is when they're at work, they're not productive, and that's what people are pressured to be. And lastly, and this is a kind of a self-evident piece, is that home has become more like the office, and I often say it's actually not working from home, it's living at work, but in my lounge room. And that we need to represent that in our workplaces and possibly go even further to make them feel a little bit more home-like to compensate. So, one thing that we know we have to remember at this point forevermore is that the workplace is no longer just a physical place. It is a hybrid of the physical and the virtual working environment come together. And in many ways, that is what's starting to change the models, and some new models are emerging, which I'll go through in some detail. These are the 5 models. But before I launch into that, I want to give you a kind of a visual example of the battle of two tech titans playing out in real time in Twitter. And I've got to say, I've got my popcorn ready, people. I'm just waiting for the next hit back. Elon on one hand, and look, I've got a Tesla. I don't mind telling you that. I love Elon on one hand, but I'm so not on this camp. I'm not agreeing with this, that if you don't turn up to work 40 hours a week, we'll assume you've resigned and we'll send you your termination papers. I'm not on board with that. And on the other hand, you've got the really great Australian example, giant striding tech killers of Atlassian and their almost 6,000 staff being told, yeah, look, turn up quarterly, let's connect, let's have some team days. You can work anywhere you want, really, essentially, as long as it's legal and as long as it works with your team. And I think that's the key part there, autonomy, freedom and choice. Just make sure you take your team members' needs and requirements into account. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm sitting back watching that and occasionally counselling my boss on which side of that equation he might want to land on. So this model is the first one, which is I think what Elon's got in his mind when he talks about you've got to be back in the office. It's kind of as it was. It was a central location in the CBD. A simple proven strategy, whether or not it had offices or workstations, doesn't really matter. My question is that good enough now? Does it attract your teams to come back? I think it was very much evolved in a time where most people worked at their own desk most of the time. So is that right anymore? You've then got the turbocharged ABW model, activity-based working, the catchword of the last decade. We think that this is going to morph into something a little bit like a deskless office, which is kind of exciting. So if any of you have got a project out there where you want a design firm to give you a deskless office, call me, because I'd really like to do one. But this one is about creating more of a kind of a place where people come together, more to collaborate than to do their solo work, I suppose. But all of the kind of the features and amenities and the kit of parts that you might have seen in a regular office are still there. Then there's the hub and spoke. Now this one is a really interesting one because it has been around for ages, and if you're a Telstra or a NAB of the world, you've probably got this in some of your big CBDs where there's a CBD hub and then there are local distributed areas, maybe Macquarie Park, maybe Parramatta, maybe out at Chadstone in Melbourne, places like that. So it's a distributed model. But what we've found over time is that what does that do to your culture? When you don't have everybody coming together, do you start to develop siloed ways of working that then become their own problem in trying to break them down? But what is really good about hub and spoke in this day and age is the fact that it's leading a resurgence in local suburban culture where people are at home, not wanting to make the commute, and leading to revival of the high street. There is, of course, the no office, which I don't want to talk about because you'll put me out of a job if you all do that. It requires very strong leadership and cultural change to make this work, so do it at your own peril. But my favourite one by far is the Clubhouse. The Clubhouse maximises collaboration, maximises connection, really brings social engagement, but based on experience, it's a win-win for everybody. If you think about it like having a clubhouse for the local footy department, it's got storage for the balls and the flag posts, it's got a barbecue for when the kids finish kicking the ball, and it's got a place where parents can congregate and tell stories and share things, so it's really wonderful. Now, all of these changes in our workplace have been happening for literally decades. About 20 years ago, most space in a workplace would have been put together just for workstations, if you like, and less for meeting and collaboration. 10 years ago, it was about 50-50. It's an acceleration of that trend that we're seeing in the world of workplace that it's only going to keep going, where we will eventually see the deskless office in that there'll be more collaboration furniture than there will be workstations. And some of the research that we've got that is starting to talk about what people want is free lunch and food, but I think that's just a very human response to wanting to break bread together. It's a very natural thing to do. Don't worry, we're not making IKEA cafeterias anywhere. It's not that kind of thing. People really, though, want fresh air from outside. There talks about a lack of trust in the built environment anymore, and that's something that lots of landlords and developers are working on. And, of course, good coffee. Why is that not top of the list? I have no idea. The other thing that people are looking for is, they're not looking for, but all of those things that I just showed you have different priorities for different genders, ages and stages of life. So in this particular diagram, apologies, the text is small, but the really big dot is the free food. So more preferred by men who are older. No surprises there. I suspect the younger women just assume it's going to be there anyway, so they don't rate it highly. But if you then have a look at the same responses but cut by company, more on the procedural and process type organisations, maybe the creatives get free coffee anyway, so it was never high on their agenda. So it's really interesting because the data is showing us what's leading people to these decisions. And what features are going to draw people back? Well, no surprises here, hopefully you all know this, but the commute has 10 times the influence on people's decision about where they work than any other factor. But the really, really good news is the second thing they want is space to work without distraction. So if you imagine this is somebody's commute and it's worth 10, if you plug in a bit of space to distract, a little bit of free food, Taco Tuesday, Pizza Friday, whatever it is, COVID-safe environment with fresh air and great places for people to work, and if you get it to plus 10, you'll probably get people back, but it's going to take getting the basics right. Now, presence and belonging, or is it the reverse way round? We found that the more time people spent in the office, the more engaged they were. And if you have a look carefully at the beige chart on the left, there's actually a significant drop right at the end there, which is we think people who are forced to work without choice are less engaged. So there is definitely a correlation between time and choice and your belonging. So just to sum up, The workplace of the future is not just a space. It is a combination of place, which is the hardware, culture, which is the humanware, technology, which is the digitalware, and experiences that you provide people, which is the software. We need places for collaboration and connection. We need places for learning and sharing. Contemplation, retreat and solitude, gardens, terraces and green spaces where you can feel connected to the community, always with coffee. Do I really need to spell that out? And it needs to be done authentically to the organisation's value and brand, inclusively so people feel welcome, and with warmth.